Starting.
Welcome one and welcome all to this episode 38 of season 10 of the internet's preeminent roast potato podcast. This week we're going to be discussing gaming on Linux and its rise, and we'll also have some type of love, maybe a blend, we're not quite sure, and we'll go over your feedback. I'm Martin, and joining me this week are Mark.
Hello,
and Alan.
Hello.
So, Mark, what have you been up to?
I have been doing a bit of network refactoring at home.
What does that mean? Unplugging things and plugging them back in again?
Sort of, and swapping equipment and changing the jobs things are doing and such. Yes.
Why?
So I mentioned before that I run a router with the Gargoyle custom firmware, and I bought that router.
Remind me what Gargoyle is?
Gargoyle is it's a custom router firmware which is based on OpenWRT. Basically, it's a bunch of plugins which provide you with a very, very usable and powerful interface with minimal faff.
Okay.
So I bought this router back when I lived in a different house, and I had a VDSL fiber to the cabinet internet connection, where you basically configured it by logging into your router and putting a username and your password from your ISP, and it sorted itself out. And that all worked very well for many years. And I've now moved where I have fibre to the home via the company who provides that in the UK. And
why was that deliberately vague?
So that means that I now have a cable modem, which can act as a hub or can act as a modem. Can act as a router or can act as a modem. So initially, I thought, well, I've got the router set up with all of my network configuration, so I'll put the router in modem mode and just connect it up. And you have to set Gargoyle settings slightly differently, as it doesn't have the same username and password configuration. But it all worked, and I was connected to the internet fine. But I noticed that while I'm paying for a connection where I should be getting about 50 megabits per second downstream, I was only getting about 30 and 25 megabits per second.
That's atrocious.
That's atrocious. And then yesterday I was monitoring this while I was working from home, and I realised I was getting 10 megabits a second down. And this...
Is that not just contention and other people being rubbish?
I'd been wondering about this, but this was in the middle of the day when most people aren't streaming Netflix in high definition, and it all seemed a bit odd. And after sort of having a bit of a chat with some people on the Telegram channel, I rebooted my router, and it jumped up, and then it jumped back down again. And so I thought, well, what happens if I try just using the ISP's router in router mode instead of modem mode and get rid of my router? And hey presto, my connection jumped up to more than the speed that I'm supposed to be getting.
Hence the vagaries about who you're with.
It's Virgin Media if anyone's interested.
Oh, fair enough.
So what I've ended up doing now, that the reason that I didn't just use the router from Virgin in the first place is for two reasons. One, they have some very, very strange and stupid rules about the Wi-Fi password you're allowed to set. And secondly, some of the software running on it is a bit rubbish. In particular, it doesn't do what the DHCP server on Gargoyle does, which is automatically add your host names into DNS, so you can just address all of your machines by host name within your network. So what I've done is I found out that the password rules on the Virgin router only use client-side validation.
Good job, Virgin.
So that means that if you basically work out the HTTP requests and send them manually with your preferred password, you can circumvent the password rules. Hooray! And then I moved my DHCP and DNS server to my other microserver, which runs various other things using DNS mask, which provides the kind of setup I want. So that's So I turned off the DNS server on the router. The DHCP server on the router. So now everything gets its DHCP addresses from my micro server and is automatically put into local DNS. Nice. So everything can talk to each other. And now I'll basically be retiring my Gargoyle router until I find a use for it again in the future.
Interesting.
Yes.
Should we get on with it?
Let's do that. Now, over the past few years, we've mentioned games quite a lot on this podcast. I know since the departure of Tony as a regular host, the mentions and I think the expertise has waned a little, but we've tried to keep up our stringent standards. So we thought in this segment we would take a bit of a look back and see where we've come over the past few years and where we think we might be going over the next few years. So, Martin, where would you like to kick us off?
Well, I've used Linux since 94, 95, and I never considered really running games on Linux. I've always used other platforms until Steam came to Linux a couple of years ago, at least for me, is when I got a Steam account. And now for me, Linux is a viable gaming platform. I'm not a hardcore gamer by any means, but all of the games and more that I'm interested in playing are now available on Steam, and I've just watched that library of games grow and grow and grow over the last few years, to the point where now I have one game in my Steam library for every hour I've put into Rust.
So I see what you're saying, and I also, I'm not like a massive gaming nerd. I play a fair amount of games, and if you looked at the number of hours I've spent in some games, you would probably be forgiven for thinking I was a gaming nerd, because I spend a lot of time in a few select games. But just looking at the number of games I've got since Steam came out, and when Steam first came out on Linux, I installed it. In fact, I think I installed Steam on a Mac we had some years ago. So that would have been like back in 2010. I think I would have installed it on there. But I didn't have very many games. I think I got a few Steam games like Portal and Portal 2, the orange box that everyone has. But now it's ludicrous. I have more games than I have probably expected lifetime left to play them. I've got 375 games in my library, of which 226 will run on Linux. And that's not a bad average. I mean, obviously I'm erring towards buying games that run on Linux, but the fact that there are enough of them, like I realize that some people, there's never enough, and the latest game isn't available, and the latest game their friends are playing that they talk with and at school and college and work, those games aren't available.
Yeah.
Might not be available, but there's enough for me. So I'm okay.
You've got 300 plus games and a couple of hundred or so that run on Linux.
And only 16 installed.
Right, yeah, that sounds similar. So I've got 200 games, all that run on Linux, because I've only been buying games for Steam since Steam came to Linux.
Right.
And
you buy all of your games through Steam?
No, I get some through Humble and some through GOG, but they've all of the Humble ones have been keys that you add to your Steam library.
Yes.
But that 200 games is more games than I have ever owned on any other platform ever.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting for me to think the sort of initial wave of commercial games on Linux for me seemed to be the Humble Bundle, as you just mentioned. So the first few Humble Indie Bundles were sort of I mean, I had played games on Linux for years before then. There's some open source games that have been in the Ubuntu repos for years, and then there's been Wine, which has been good for getting a variety of games running. But then Humble Bundle actually came along with games that you could pay for on Linux and the developers would support on Linux, which was a bit of a step change for me. but it was still a few years before Steam came along, and now basically, the Humble has shifted basically to selling Steam keys because Steam is the platform for games on Linux. But I myself have 185 games on Steam, 144 of which run on Linux.
Yeah. And then there's all the other platforms. Like Steam is not the only place to get games. Obviously, you've got GOG and itch.io, where there's still like I have a ton of games on itch.io some that I've not played yet, and I feel terrible because I'm that kind of person who like buys the games because they're cheap, because it's on sale, or because there's a Humble Bundle. Like you say, like recently I bought a Humble Bundle, and I'm looking in my Steam collection, and of that Humble Bundle, only 3 or 4 of them are available for Linux, and the rest of them are Windows only. So I will probably never play those 10 or 15 other games that came in the bundle. And I feel a bit bad for that, because some of them look okay.
So I've got lots of games I've never played, and some I probably never will, because like I say, I don't have a huge amount of time for playing games unless it's Rust.
And it feels like we get a lot of press about the number of Linux gamers that there are, and that there are this many in the Steam stats survey, how many machines are running Linux. And while that might be interesting to people who are observing the Linux ecosystem and people who are considering releasing games for Linux, because if the market is so small that there aren't enough people to sustain the port, and there's not enough people out there who are going to buy the game, then they might look at those stats and think, well, I'm not going to bother because there's not enough people who will buy the game anyway, so therefore why would I bother making the effort, that the engineering effort to release that thing on and support it on Linux. The flip side of that is I'm not super fussed about all those stats about how many people run games on Linux in Steam or whatever platform, because there's enough for me. It's a very selfish thing, but like I said, I've got far more than I will ever play, and I'm all right.
Yeah, and also, depending on the accuracy of the statistics and when they were sampled, there is documented evidence that there is over 1 million Linux gamers on Steam. Now, for a lot of the smaller indie studios, that's enough of a market to make, porting your game to Linux worthwhile, a lot of whom are working with Unity, and that effort is made quite straightforward for a lot of developers.
Yeah, well, that's another development that's come along, I think, is more of the tools that people are using to develop games and more of the engines. I mean, there was a lot of mono development a few years back, which I always thought that mono was just a niche thing for people to get apps designed for, like .NET apps for Windows, like running on Linux, and then it turns out that lots of people are developing with mono so that they can have cross-platform games, and then Unity has now added Linux support. It's a sort of a gradual shift in the tooling as well, which has helped this sort of come into fruition.
Yeah.
So, does it matter that it's not every single game? Does it matter that the very latest game? Like I posted a video to you earlier on today about a game that I thought looked quite fun, and your immediate reply was, not available on Linux. And that kind of deflated me a bit, and I thought, I'd really like to play that. And so I did get an element of that feeling that, that thing that everyone else is playing that looks really cool, and I keep seeing lots of YouTube videos. I got an element of that, damn it, I can't have shiny new things. But then the realism hit me that, but Alan, you've got like 200 games you could be playing.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, there is that. I get that a lot. I mean, I'm not like massive hardcore gamer, but there are certain games which have come out over the past few years. I mean, 2 particular examples, Elite Dangerous and Fallout 4, which aren't going to be released for Linux, and you can't get them running in Wine, and it doesn't look like you're going to be able to in the immediate future. And I miss them. I mean, I still have lots of games to play, but I mean, I have a lot of friends who they don't care. They don't care what OS they're running. They want to play the games, and they won't even consider running Linux if it's not going to be able to play the latest games.
I think that kind of the self-identifying yourself as an inverted commas gamer, and you've probably got a mouse with 8 buttons or more. 8 buttons, you're probably thinking, huh, Alan, ludicrous. I've got way more buttons than 8. And, it's a super high-end mouse with super precision laser, and you've got the right gaming keyboard with the right mechanical keys, or one of Wimpy's crazy keyboards that's designed specifically just for playing games. If you're that kind of person, sure, you are the equivalent of that guy who runs Photoshop and will not switch to Linux because Photoshop is not available, right? There's nothing that's going to get you to switch.
So when I started buying games on Steam for Linux, I suppose I approached this a bit like when you're making the choice, do you get a PlayStation or a Nintendo or an Xbox?
Yeah.
There are going to be some games that don't come to your platform.
Right.
And that's the way I've gone about this. There are games available for the platform I choose to use, and there are some that are not. And boo-hoo, I just have to suck that up and live with it. In the same way I would if, in the console world.
Yes, although it has to be said that, generally speaking, games that are available for one of the consoles will more often than not also be available for Windows. It's not always the case, but it's the case a lot more than, a game that's available for the PlayStation will definitely be available on the Xbox.
Mm-hmm. So in November 2013, 4 years ago, there were 236 games available for Linux on Steam. 2 years later, there was 1,400 games.
Wow.
And then today, there are 2,519 Linux games on Steam.
So that's a tenfold increase over
in 4
about 5 years.
Yeah, 4 years exactly. Yeah. And of those, 42% of the top 1,000 games on Steam are available for Linux.
How are you measuring top games?
It's those that have received 91% or higher positive reviews.
Right.
So good games.
Good games.
These aren't necessarily like the sort of the AAA games in terms of the money pumped into them and the marketing and the graphics
this is,
and so on, but these are the games that people enjoy playing.
Popularity on the platform generally.
Right.
And I think there's a byproduct of it. There was a few byproducts of this. Like, there's been a push because there's more people wanting to play these games. We've had a push for, please, can we have updated versions of NVIDIA drivers and other drivers for the mouse or things that let you control the keyboard controls, is it Razer keyboards and Razer mice that have an application that you use to control them?
I'm using it right now. So there's two components. There's one tool called OpenRazer, which is the daemon that speaks to the devices to control the RGB and the various other things you can tweak. And then Luke Horwell, who is the co-developer of Ubuntu Mate Welcome, maintains a bit of software called Polychromatic, which is then the front-end user interface to that utility. And I'm using it right now because I have a number of Razer products, and that's what I use. And
those kind of things wouldn't exist if people weren't moving to Linux for their gaming or wanting to run games on their Linux systems. And
we've talked about these are open source initiatives, but Razer themselves have now got a Linux corner in their forums, where they're courting Linux enthusiasts and finding out what would be required in order for them to support Linux on their laptops, which have become very popular in recent years.
What do we reckon the future of this is? Are we always destined to have 42% of the top 1,000 Steam games? Are we always destined to have a single-digit % of the entire gaming market? Is there something that will come along that will just suddenly explode the number of Linux?
There's been a
gamers? Couple
of culture shifts which have sort of come alongside the growth in Linux gaming, which I'm wondering might sort of contribute more to games being released on Linux in the future, and those are crowdfunding and early access. So a lot of crowdfunding campaigns for games have Linux as a stretch goal, and increasingly as they say, if particularly if the game's going to be an independent game based on Unity, say that it's going to be day one as a thing to try and get Linux money into the crowdfunding campaign.
I'm really wary of crowdfunders that have Linux as a stretch goal, because historically that's been a poor return on hitting those goals and then seeing Linux versions manifest.
Yeah, I'm similar. I've backed a bunch of games, a few indie games on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, and the ones that have put it front and center as it will be cross-platform on day one. Most of those that have succeeded have successfully done that, and there's a couple that haven't released yet, but they have Linux builds, and I'm already playing them. The ones that have it as a stretch goal, like I think Elite Dangerous had it either as a stretch goal or as a really far out, maybe if we get enough people, and then it was just dropped. And that was one I didn't back. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there is certain things like that can push adoption. And also new hardware devices, things like the VR and AR stuff. The AR stuff really only happens on mobile, and I don't think will ever come to Linux. But the VR stuff, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly convinced about AR for gaming anyway. VR, perhaps. Well, I mean, VR is actually having some success in the gaming market.
Yeah, it's early days. I still, I mean, I know we talk about this every year, and Martin puts on his grumpy face every time, but I think it's still early days. I don't think I wouldn't put VR in the same category as I would put 3D TVs. I would put VR in the same category as I would put 8K TVs. It's a thing that's a bit far away, and it's probable that not many people will have it in the next couple of years, but it will come. Whereas I think 3D TVs are a thing that was just ludicrous, and I think that's...
Yeah, and I think the other impact that, Steam coming to Linux has had is that I can remember that OpenGL versions in Mesa were really lagging behind, what the industry standards were by major versions, not just points. And now we have Mesa implementations that are bang up to date with the industry specifications, and then we have leading edge Vulkan support. We even had F1 2017 released last week, which is Vulkan only.
Did you play that, Martin?
I purchased that on day release day, and I have played that game, and it's brilliant. And Vulkan is quite amazing because the frame rates on that are unlike any other game that I've played.
So the other thing that's interesting is there's even a community around people who just Twitch game, people who play on Twitch and play on YouTube gaming, and stream their games online. There is a community of people like Gartner, the Linux Gamer, Hex DSL. Who else plays games on Linux?
Gaming on Linux.
Gaming on Linux. Yeah.
The Linux Gamecast.
Yeah, Gaming on Linux. We're on that sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's all these people who focus on playing games specifically on Linux. If there wasn't a big enough market for those people to be able to make a bit of revenue off Patreon or YouTube, then they almost certainly wouldn't be doing it. It's interesting. I'm interested to hear from our listeners as well. Do you game on Linux? Do you have a Linux machine that you use, to play games, or do you have a Game OS Windows machine or something else? And I'm interested to know where people get the games, whether they get them from Steam or some other download place, or only from the archive or Playdeb or Play on Linux or Wine, or maybe you're a filthy mobile casual. Tell us if you're a filthy casual. And I didn't write that. Maybe I did. Yeah, that's the end of that.
If you love the command line as much as we do, send us a command that will blow our minds, and we might even mention it on the show. Send your command line love to show@ubuntupodcast.org.
So something I added to my machine is 2 packages this week. And I'm running 1604 on my laptop, and I use multiple workspaces and frequently leave something running, a long-running job on one of the workspaces, leave it running, and I want to come back to it when it's finished. And there's a feature that Elementary has that I really, really like, which is when a long-running job in a terminal finishes, you get a notification. So you can go over there and check on it and move it forward and do whatever the next thing is in your sequence. And I often run Snapcraft to build something, and it takes a long time to compile rather big things, and I leave it running somewhere on another desktop, on another workspace, and I kind of forget about it. I get on doing another, replying to emails or threads on a forum or whatever, and I forget about that thing running, and then I think, oh god, yeah, that thing was running, and I go over and it finished 3 hours ago, or it finished 5 seconds after I started it, because there was a syntax error or something. So these two things implement the thing that Elementary has to notify you when long-running jobs finish. One of them is called Undistract Me, and that just gives you the notification when a long-running task is finished. And Undistract Me is available, I think it's in the archive, actually.
It is, yep.
Mm-hmm. So you could just apt install Undistract Me, but to implement it, I think you have to tweak something in your bash RC.
No, it does that. It does that for you. All you need to do is just log out of your session and log in again. Yeah.
Okay, so I did that, but because I'm running Unity, which has these ephemeral notifications which appear and then disappear, if I left it running on another workspace and then went and made a cup of tea and came back, the notification would appear and then disappear, and I wouldn't see it. So then I needed another thing. And the other thing I wanted was a piece of software called Recent Notifications. And what this does is put a little icon in the indicator area, which is white and blends into all the other icons. But any notification that occurs, it goes green. So that if I start a long-running job, go away from my computer and come back, if that thing finished while I was away from my computer, I'll see a little green icon in the notification area in the top right of the corner of the screen. I click on it and I get a historical list of every notification that's appeared. So this kind of, in inverted commas, fixes the Unity notifications that are ephemeral and just disappear and you never see them again by keeping a record of which command finished, what date and time, and then you can just clear the notifications when you're done, and it goes back to being a white icon and wait for the next one. And this is something that I like about GNOME Shell, that you get this history of notifications that you don't get in Unity, and this fixes that for Unity users.
It also fixes it for the distro that shall not be named in exactly the same way.
Yeah, but we're not going to talk about that. Let's move on.
We love getting your feedback. If you've got a comment about something you hear on the show, why don't you drop us an email on show@ubuntupodcast.org.
And now it's time for your feedback. And our first feedback this week is from someone who did choose to email us to show@ubuntupodcast.org, and it's from Matthew Boone.
I'm running Ubuntu 17.10 on my laptop, and I'm really impressed so far.
Yay.
It's a great first step towards Ubuntu making GNOME its own, and already a comfortable home for those used to Unity. I'd also like to see Canonical adopt the Pixel Saver extension the way they did dash-to-dock. I understand the theme is also being updated ahead of 1804, which is welcome. It's really nice to see the near unanimous positive buzz around this release, and I'm optimistic 1804 will be the best LTS since 1204.
That's quite something to live up to. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Zach Villiers emailed us.
A note of thanks.
Zach Villas. I thought there was an I in there. Zach Villas emailed us.
A note of thanks for the wonderful 17.10 release. I don't normally use Ubuntu, but after having problems with graphics and system lockups on my regular distro, I gave Ubuntu Mate a whirl. It did everything I wanted, looked nice out the box, and I was wowed by the non-free NVIDIA driver performance. I haven't had much luck with the non-LTS from Ubuntu, but Artful seems to be a different animal so far. Overall, this release is, as my dad used to say, slicker than cow slobbers, which in rural West Virginia, wrong accent, US, is a compliment, meaning it works and looks quite well. That's a great phrase. I love that, Zach.
Thank you for the kind words, Zach.
Yep. Elio Campitelli emailed us.
I think it's Elio Campitelli. Come on, try harder.
Oh, my goodness, it's Accent Central over here now. Elio says, I use Elementary OS and had trouble getting used to those big fat header bars, but now I really love them. They are a great place to add buttons, search fields and other functionality. In well-designed applications, it can make better use of the space. I think the main problem comes with applications that don't take advantage of their functionality and just ship ugly and messy menus. That said, I do think there are some types of complex applications that don't translate well and need menus and all that stuff. So I say, stop worrying and learn to love the fat header bars.
Do you know, as you're reading that mail, for some reason I was getting flashbacks of the original version of The Italian Job and Benny Hill going, I love them fat. I really like them fat. I don't know why, but okay. If you like them that way, so be it.
Tobias Anderson Gidlund left a message on our Google Plus page.
As a long-time GNOME Ubuntu user, I'm really pleased to be back on Ubuntu proper with 17.10. I use the pure GNOME session as I don't like the Unity look of Ubuntu as it is, but I must say that even the pure GNOME session is looking better than it ever did. Wow, that's really great. Good to hear.
Yeah. Gareth Whitty emailed us.
On the next Ubuntu podcast, please give hints on a full install of Ubuntu Mate onto a USB stick so you can run a full system from the stick.
That's easy.
Go on then.
Use 2 sticks. One stick with use one stick with the live installer that you've DD'd on.
Yeah.
Boot off it. Plug another USB stick that you want to be the one that is going to run the system and install from the live one to the other one, and then pull them both out and then boot off the one you installed onto. That's the super easy way that I would do it.
That's a great way of doing it. If your name was Jesse, perhaps you just DD the live image over your hard disk. That also works.
Freek van Hemmert emailed us.
The battling balloon fighting robots sounded extremely awesome, and making them and subsequently playing with them as kids sound even more awesome. Are there any instructions on how you build them? But also, how did you set up the class? What did you buy and prepare for? I love to do such a thing at my son's school here in the Netherlands. Any information is welcome. I've just realised I read that as battling baboon, but it was battling balloon, wasn't it?
That'd be even more fun.
Completely different image.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid I can't take credit for setting up the whole class. That goes to a lady called Sarah from Science Oxford, who actually runs the classes and does all the prep. But essentially, there's a link which will go in the show notes, which is the robot car chassis that we use. And basically, she's bought a bunch of those and some motor controller boards. And then that connects to the edge connector from the BBC microbit. And then the BBC microbit has a bunch of APIs for doing things like controlling motors and talking to each other with radio links, all on board in MicroPython. So you can create a controller that way.
Interestingly, I bought one of these robots a couple of years ago, these robot kits. There's a couple of motors, some plastic parts, and the Perspex bit that I received had shattered in the mail.
Yes.
Was broken in half. Did you have that problem as well?
There's been, I think when they ordered the first few, it was fine when they sort of came packaged individually, but bulk buying them, they tend to just come all shoved in one bag, and some of them turn up broken. So Be careful who you're ordering from.
Yes, I had that problem, and I contacted the eBay seller, and they just sent me another one. They didn't ask me to send the busted one back. They just sent me another one. So it might be worth, if you're doing this for a class, over order.
Yes.
And then you have enough for your class, and you can get the fixes to come later.
Yes, and one important component that I didn't mention there, for actually popping the balloons, we just used a carpenter's awl, which is essentially a mounted spike, and gaffer taped that on the front.
Brilliant.
Very effective. Next up, Nadra Mastor left a comment on our website.
Has
PARS received some sort of independent security audit like EU FOSA did for KeyPass?
Now, it's worth mentioning here that parse is actually just a bash script which uses GPG for encryption. So it's as secure as GPG is. Right. I don't know if that's had an independent audit, but there you go. Oh, sorry, it's me again. Martin Waite left a... Oh, not Martin. Oh, dear. Oh, it's getting late in the evening. Matt Waite left a comment on our Facebook page.
It's worth waiting for. Yummy roast potatoes is what Matt says. He's right.
I made some yummy roast potatoes at the weekend.
Yummy. Is that all the feedback?
That is all of the feedback.
And that's all for episode 38. We'll be back next week when we'll have more news, comment, and discussion.
And maybe a quiz.
Really?
No.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Should we have a quiz or something for the end of year? Or we're going to do the end of year predictions, aren't we?
Oh,
I'm going
yes.
to lose that one. Maybe we should have a quiz the week
I can't even
before that or
remember what I
something.
predicted.
End of the
Probably will
world.
come true. I probably won.
See you next time. Bye.
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 Can I get back to playing Rust now?
Yes, let's go.